Our next speaker is Mr. Gareth Jenkins from the Institute for Security and Development Policy. Mr. Jenkins is a writer and analyst based in Istanbul, Turkey, where he has been resident since 1989. His special fields of interests are civil-military relations, political Islam, terrorism and security, and the Kurdish issue. His publications include Context and Circumstance, the Turkish Military and Politics, 2001, Political Islam in Turkey, Running West, Heading East, 2008, Between Fact and Fantasy, Turkey's Ergenekon Investigation from 2009, and Occasional Allies, Enduring Rivals, Turkey's relations with Iran, published in 2011. He's currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Central Asian Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies Program Joint Center. So without further ado, Mr. Jenkins.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to have to put my reading glasses on, so you all disappear into a blur. So I'll be talking into a fog. I'm going to try and make a few comments. I don't think they're necessarily going to form a cohesive whole, but a little bit on Islam in Turkey, and also how this greater sense of Islamic identity now in Turkey affects Turkey's foreign relations and the AK Party's foreign ambitions. First of all, a few words on political Islam in Turkey. A lot of you will know these things already, but I'll just run through them anyway. One of the interesting things I think singles out the Islamist movement in Turkey from Islamist movements in a lot of other countries in the region is that during the late Ottoman Empire, and particularly in the early Republic, the reforms destroyed the ulema, this class of Islamic clerics and theologians. And so when you had the Islam returning to the public sphere, particularly since 1950 onwards, it wasn't really being driven by the theologians. It was really kind of a mass social movement, and in the sense of Islam being kept alive as a political force, it was done more within the Sufi networks, most particularly the Naqshbandis, rather than having clerics. And I think this also affected the type of Islam which began then to move into the public sphere. Instead of being an Islam which was based on, political Islam which is based on, for example, calls for the Sharia, it was more about values and identity. We have certain iconic clashes, such as over the headscarf in Turkish universities. But when you generally look at it, it is more about the values and identity. And even today, when you look at political Islam in Turkey, there isn't a great deal of desire really for the Sharia. It is more based on Islam and on identity and values. And there's also a very strong social component in political Islam in Turkey, when you can almost a direct connection really between urbanization and the rise of political Islam. When people began to move in from the countryside during the 1950s, they brought with them the values of the countryside, the values of what usually referred to as folk Islam. And when you look at this compared then with the Kemalist ideology, I think if you, of course I wasn't alive then, but if you visited Turkey in the 1930s and you went to the towns, you would see that Kemalism had really kind of penetrated the towns, and nearly every town had its little village square and its tea garden and its statue of Ataturk, which replaced the previous focus of the local community of being a mosque or something like this. But Kemalism didn't penetrate very deeply into rural society, partly because the illiteracy. I mean, there was very limited literacy during the early years of the Republic, and the school system didn't penetrate very much outside the kind of more urban settlements of towns and cities. So you have, with this social movement, not only people moving into the cities, but you also have some of their values moving to the cities. Of course, it's an oversimplification to put it just in these kind of two forces. But this also, with Islam in Turkey, it's the return of Islam to the political arena, I don't think would have happened without this mass social movement. And we've also seen under the AK Party, going back really into the 1990s, I mean, I think Henri mentioned this yesterday about the Anatolian Tigers, that the AK Party in many ways is also as much a product of a social movement and an economic change as it is of a theological determinant in the sense of a desire for a more Islamic presence in public life. We've had in the last 20 years the creation of, not creation is too strong a word, the appearance of a conservative bourgeoisie. When people began to move in from the countryside, they brought with them their values. Also, some people started setting up businesses in small towns, which were the Anatolian Tigers that Henri referred to yesterday. Many of these actually now have their headquarters in Istanbul. And when you look at the bankrolling of the Islamist party, it's mostly coming from this particular social class. So you have these, instead of just looking at political Islam in Turkey purely in kind of theological terms, you have to take into account these social changes. And when you look at a lot of the policies of Erdogan and of the AK Party, they're also the policies of somebody with people with a commercial mindset. That this conservative bourgeoisie, this great emphasis on trade that's come with the AK Party. This is why some of their core constituents are the merchants who also, as I said, bankrolling the movement and the party. Why does this matter in terms of the region? One of the interesting things for me, my book has a question mark at the end where it says running west, heading east. It's a question mark. But one of the interesting things when I was writing the book on political Islam in Turkey was I was looking for great Turkish theologians, and you don't find them. And this is something which is very interesting. When you look at the Islamic theology, there are two main kind of intellectual centers. One, of course, is the Arab world, and the other is in Asia, particularly in the subcontinent. And Turkey hasn't made any great intellectual contribution to Islamic thinking. And this makes it difficult, I think, for Turkey to establish itself as an intellectual center of the Islamic world. I'll come a little bit later to Fethullah Gülen, his followers would claim he's a great and internationally respected Islamic thinker. I would say that's not actually the case. But even if you put Fethullah Gülen to one side for the moment, I think you can see that there aren't any others. In terms of, we mentioned yesterday in one of the presentations about strategic depth, this book by Ahmet Davutoğlu. If you go back to 1994, he wrote another book called Civilizational Transformation and the Muslim World, which has two advantages to it. One is it's in English, and the other it's about 40% of the length of strategic depth. But if you look at that, you can see a lot of the ideas that he's tried to implement, particularly in the last couple of years. He became foreign minister in May 2009. And particularly, I think, since from 2010 onwards, this idea that he was trying to push of having almost an Islamic alternative to the European Union, with customs, certainly in terms of the customs union, with customs free areas, with the trade tariff-free areas, and lifting visas. All of these ideas in Civilizational Transformation and the Muslim World. It's written in English in Malaysia, and I think it was mainly directed at a Muslim audience. And for that reason, perhaps he's a lot more explicit. Very, very strongly anti-Western. Also calls for a replacement of NATO with a security architecture with Islamic. And when I first read it, I thought it was all just academic theorizing, because at that time he was an academic and not a politician. But as I said, a lot of these ideas he then tried to put into practice. And if you want to look really at the roots of the foreign policy he's pursuing, it really goes back to this book, More Than Strategic Depth, which he's padded out with turgid, tedious pages of theorizing. Why am I mentioning this in the context of Islam? Because when Davutoğlu calls for resurrection of the caliphate, albeit he says in a different form. He calls for a single Islamic polity. He calls really for a separation of the Islamic world from the non-Islamic world. And his idea, his view, and I think we've seen it also at some of these references to this yesterday in speeches by Erdogan. We also see it sometimes in speeches by Erdogan to a civilizational divide based on religion. And even though within that civilizational divide there can be different countries, Erdogan does see the world, and Davutoglu does see the world in terms of Muslim and non-Muslim. But within this idea of greater unity between Islamic countries is a very strong sense of Ottoman nostalgia. I think this was dismissed by one of the speakers yesterday, but if you live in Istanbul, as I have for a long time, was said in the introduction, you'll see that the Ottoman nostalgia, particularly in the last few years, has taken off extraordinarily. It's not just the soap operas, it's not just the hospitals, the universities, all these things named after figures from the Ottoman Empire. There's even a housing development now in Maslak by Ağoğlu, one of the biggest contractors in Turkey. It's called Maslak 1453, after the conquest of Istanbul. You see it even sometimes in some of the names of exhibitions, of conferences organized by the municipality, where they use Ottoman grammatical constructions. And there was I'd never read the book, but God help me, I'm probably going to have to. There was billboards a few weeks ago advertising a book called Muslim Rome, the future, Turkey's near future. And this idea again of that Turkey is going to reappear as the preeminent force in the Islamic world. It's not for a complete recreation of the Ottoman Empire as was, because, for example, there doesn't seem to be any great desire to retake what are now the predominantly Christian countries in the Balkans. But in the sense of having a closer union of Islamic countries led by Turkey, that sense that the desire underpins Davutoglu's foreign policy. As it's relatively fairly articulated in civilizational transformation of the Muslim world. And you also see it coming out in a lot of his speeches. When he talks about Turkey's emergence as a regional superpower, he talks about history reassuming its natural course. So Islam and Turkey in the Muslim world, it's not just about, it's not at all, in fact, about a union of equals. The AK Party really does see Turkey as being a primus inter pares, as leading. And this is a major problem, I think, for the other Muslim countries. Partly because the Arabs in particular don't like Turkey telling them, you've got to be like us. This is how you combine religion and democracy. I'm always a bit alarmed when people hold up Turkey as a model to the Muslim world and don't hold up Norway. This seems to me religious prejudice. Are you telling me that a Muslim country only deserves a partial democracy instead of a full one? But it's also a problem when, for example, in Erdogan's Arab Spring tour in, I think, September 2011, when he visited Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt, and he annoyed the Muslim Brotherhood very much by saying, you should be like us. This is how you put together religion and a political system. And the Arabs in particular, as I say, don't like the idea of Turks telling them how to interpret their religion. This is the first major problem. Second major problem is nobody likes being told how to behave. And also, of course, in the Arab world, there's very strong Arab nationalism or Arab nationalisms. And it's one of the most frustrating things, about being in Turkey, and you talk to Turks about the Ottoman Empire, and particularly amongst all this Ottoman nostalgia, it's not just the Greeks and Armenians who don't share Turks' happy memories, it's also the Arabs. And it's, I think, a situation where less could be more. If Turkey wasn't pushing so hard, it could actually be a lot more successful in the Arab world. The Arabs, particularly the Muslims, are a lot happier to have closer ties with Turkey, and I think there is a sense that they see the AK Party as Turkey returning to its Islamic roots, but they want to be partners, they don't want to be subordinates. And the problem with this ambition in Davutoğlu in particular, but also in Erdogan, is that they see Turkey as being a leader, not as being a partner. And for these reasons, I think it's going to be very difficult for Turkey to achieve these ambitions. Just something very briefly now on the divisions within the Turkish Islam. I said previously, Turkey hasn't produced any great Islamic theologians. And you can see that when people look outside, always for inspiration. I have to be very quick, so I have to cut a couple of things I was going to say. But just very briefly, a few words on Fethullah Gülen. He is not popular in the Arab world. The Fethullah Gülen movement is very influential in a lot of countries, but it hasn't really made any inroads into the Arab world. And he's not taken seriously as an Islamic theologian. And so for that reason, I think when you look at the Gülen movement, which was Ottoman Nostalgia, is particularly strong, then it's going to be very difficult for Turkey to achieve really its regional ambitions by using the Gülen movement. In the Q&A session, I can get into more with the Gülen movement. Just very briefly, though, in summary, I would disagree with the overall picture presented of the AK Parti's rule in power. It was given in the first presentation. And when I look at, I've been there 23 years, and initially, of course, it's a military-dominated authoritarian regime, and now we're having a civilian-dominated authoritarian regime. We're going from one form of authoritarianism to another. And that, to answer the question really in the title of this panel, is that a model for the rest of the world? Absolutely not. Thank you.